In this video, we'll cover different penetration testing approaches. These approaches will help us with the process of planning, execution, and reporting of an actual pen test engagement. And there are different approaches to actually complete those activities. To kind of go over some of the overview of what we're going to cover in the presentation, we're going to go through a number of these approaches: OSS-DMM, ISEV, OWASP, WAC, threat classification, NIST, PMBOK, penetration testing framework, PTEST, PCI DSS penetration testing, and then we will talk about some reporting lessons learned, as well as emphasize executive and technical reporting. So the first one we will touch on is the open source security testing approach manual. With this particular approach, the focus is more on high-level project management, sometimes certification actually of the completed assessment. This is the only approach that offers actually a certification upon completion that can be validated, and in order to actually be certified upon completion, there's a number of requirements that have to be met, and the consultants need to be certified. Something interesting is that the actual approach is taking a scientific approach, and it's working on quantifying the actual operational security cost requirements and finding a way to map them against business objectives. There are 4 groups: scope, channel, index, and vector. In the scope, collect information about the assets, in this case the targets. The channel, communication method to interact with the assets. It's a physical approach. Classification of target asset, IP MAC, and then vector is the direction for assessing the target. So looking into this particular approach, they're focusing on particular assessment objectives. So blind, double blind, gray box, double gray, tandem, reversed, and so on. And all of these approaches are related to the level of knowledge about the target, as well as the whether or not the target staff is informed about the penetration testing. So with this, this is kind of the mapping of the type of the engagement. So if you're looking into this particular figure, you have an arrow going from bottom to top, and this is related to the target's knowledge of the attack, and then from left to right, attacker's knowledge of the target. So the double blind is kind of the bottom, so both don't have much information, not necessarily informed. Maybe from the attacker simulation perspective, the client will provide only an IP address or a domain name, and then specific objectives, but nothing else. And then, you're looking into a reversal, tandem. Tandem is where is obviously the most information, and the purpose is to truly kind of, engage in this purple team where there's a lot of knowledge transfer, there's a lot of simulation, cause and effect, and helping with building the internal proficiency of the client team. So in addition to the components that we've covered here, it's interesting that there's some significant benefits of using OSDMM. There's a risk assessment value, and it actually provides a calculation of the security overall value based on operational security, loss controls, and limitations, and that's the RAF score. So you get some quantification there. And then you have security test audit report, which is again capable of providing some compliance certification against those objectives that were evaluated. The disadvantage of OSDMM, very detailed, and it's not necessarily adapted for beginner level penetration testers. So if you're looking into identifying particular steps for completing a phase and using a specific tool or approach, And what are the deliverables? You're not going to get this. This is the next high level. Now, on the contrary, ISAF, the Information System Security Assessment Framework, is the opposite. It can be complemented with OSS-TMM as it provides more of the technical how-to of each phase. So where OSS-TMM was more focused on the business objectives, alignment of operational security strategy, and kind of the certification, ISAF is more focused on the practical execution and completion of the different phases. Now, some of the disadvantages is the ISAF is very outdated. OWASP. OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project, and they're famous for their top 10 web application vulnerabilities, but they also provide a testing guideline. And the testing guideline is kind of interesting. It focuses particularly from the development and then production perspective. So what are the things that we can test for during the product development, during the development of the actual application, mobile or web, and then after. And this is talking about specifics. The limitation of this particular approach is that the focus is mostly on web applications, or layer 7. It can include layer 6, some of the database, the transactions between database and application, but that's kind of the limitation. So it's very thorough. It's really oriented towards the holistic approach of assessing for web application, sometimes mobile application vulnerabilities from the development to production. But that's kind of the limitation. So excellent if you were to focus on web and mobile. Sometimes it can be adapted to Internet of Things, although they have a specific model for IoT. And then you have the Web Application Security Consortium threat classification. And this is another approach that focuses on layer 7, the web application security. While this is great, just like OWASP, but there are other aspects. We have the network security, we have the physical security, the social engineering, we have other aspects that don't make the WAC threat classification approach a holistic approach. It's a rather narrow focus on web applications. Now, this particular one, it's kind of interesting because WAC can be aligned with OWASP Top 10, and it's more detailed than OWASP, provides 3 interesting views, and these are ways to represent the same core data based on your function. So enumeration, so this is focusing on attacks and weaknesses that can lead to a compromise of a website, its data, and the users. Development, it's truly during the development lifecycle and introducing secure coding. And the taxonomy cross-reference is a map against other guidelines, and there's some examples there with given WAC threat classification can map against OWASP, KPAC, the common weakness exposure, and other ones. So NIST, so the special publication 800.15 is kind of designed, it seems like the version that I have referenced is 2008. It's a government standard, and it's really synthesized and focused on high-level execution, management approach, and reporting. So if you are working for a government system, that may be the preferred type of assessment. It's not truly robust. It's holistic, so it can be applied to an application, database, mobile, enterprise, and so on. But some of the approaches, maybe there's a reference to social engineering, but maybe not necessarily to vishing or some of the later approaches. Very simplified. And what it looks like is you have a planning stage, then you're going through discovery, attack, and then reporting. So very easy to use, widely adapted, probably one of the top three most common, I would say, approaches for completing a pen test. Then you have the project management body of knowledge. Now, why is this referenced? This is about project management. Well, in the context of a pen test, PMBOK has an application, but not for necessarily completing the pen test. It's more from the project management aspect. What is a project? Well, typically an activity with a start-end date, assigned resources, a specific budget, deliverables. You're looking into a particular work breakdown structures. You're looking into different phases, and the pen test actually matches, a project. The pen test is a project. So understanding PMBOK can help us manage the deliverables and kind of the planning of each phase of the actual pen test. It is not designed for necessarily executing the pen test, as I mentioned. So with PMBOK, we have the initiation phase, and kind of, let's say that during our information discovery phase as part of the pen test, we need to actually have initiation. So where we develop the project charter, what are the resources going to be dedicated to the information gathering? What is the timeline? What is the scope? What are the rules of engagement? Do we sign a contract? Then you're looking into the planning. The planning is actually the blueprint for executing the particular phase. So in the context of information gathering, what are we going to do? We will, dedicate X number of hours, days, and resources to potentially footprinting the target. So identifying the network map of the resources that are in scope. Then we'll focus on perhaps fingerprinting, so identifying operating systems and further enumerating the particular assets to discover open ports, running services, and versions. So with this in mind, the other phases are obviously the execution. This is where we actually run the tools. So we'll use a tool like Nmap, and then we'll need to perform quality check, making sure that we configure the scan in a manner that will provide accurate results. And during the execution, actually, we'll get some results, and it's important to record those results. Sometimes we have a one-shot to make sure that we're actually validating the result. Sometimes a system will crash, a port will be closed based on a condition, and we have one shot to validate that on this day at this time, this was the result of checking for a particular vulnerability. And then we have the closing. So we've gathered the results during information gathering. We found those open ports, the services, the versions of the actual running applications, any additional information, and we need to move on. We need to close out that particular phase and move on to the next, which can be vulnerability identification with the information we gathered during our information discovery. And then monitoring control, so constantly. Let's say that we went to the vulnerability identification, and the ports and the services, there were no vulnerabilities associated. Well, with monitoring control, we're actually an ongoing process. We're monitoring the validity, the accuracy, but also we have an opportunity to kind of restart the process and start over if there's no results and we didn't achieve the objectives. So long story short, PMBOK great from a project management and managing the deliverables, expectations, requirements for the pen test overall or individual phases within the pen test. We're talking about the penetration testing framework. So this is a standard that was developed in the United Kingdom. It's kind of the first time that I remember I came across the standard was about 8 years ago, and at the time of the recording we were in 2017. So it was actually the most comprehensive guideline at that time that provided some steps and approaches for completing a pen test. And this particular, they call it framework, provides not just the different phases, uh, but also the tools, the approaches, the commands, the results you're supposed to see. So very, interesting approach. Um, it's objective focused. For example, you're scanning Cisco equipment or you're working on network segmentation, and it's kind of a objective specific, not necessarily a holistic approach. It tells you that in order to assess a Cisco device, look into configuration, particular commands, but it's again focused on more on the technical aspect of evaluating an asset, not necessarily the holistic approach of the entire network, and how to go from information gathering to the vulnerability analysis and deliver the reporting. Great thing about this particular framework is it provides a couple of templates. So the pre-engagement, it provides a template. It's more of a checklist with ideas of what things to include, and make sure you're doing your survey, site survey, to understand what's included, what's not, and then also provides you a template for reporting. So can it be used? Yeah, it's still, I think, relevant for objective driven scenarios. Still can be a very applicable approach. And then you have the penetration testing execution standard. By far, this is my favorite. It's the most up to date, the most comprehensive, and the reason I stated comprehensive is also it's adapted from a project management perspective. So high level. What do I need to do during the pre-engagement? So before I engage a client, what are some of the things I need to think of? Non-disclosure, the scoping, the rules of engagement. Then it tells me, what do I need to do during the actual engagement? So this is the actual technical guidelines. It's adapted for beginner, advanced. It's telling you some lessons learned. It's telling you some, tools that are up to date, and what are some of the deliverables? What are the results you should be looking for? And then also it's telling you not just the before, during, but also after the technical execution, and it's focusing on the reporting, the presentation of the results. It's really nice and comprehensive. It's done by professionals that do the pen testing on a day-to-day for professionals that are doing it day-to-day or are to start their careers doing pen testing. Really like the standard. Highly suggest you explore this. The one area that's kind of interesting, and I think that can be done perhaps from a different perspective, is the threat modeling. Threat modeling takes a very long time. It's not typically an approach that can be done every single time. Sometimes the threat modeling can be avoided or not included in the scope. So during the intelligence gathering, what we're doing is we're discovering open ports, running services, and they're talking about all the gamut of deliverables we should be going after. During the threat modeling, we're modeling threat. It's kind of like the data flow, and then we're identifying based on the type of assets, the data, the different weaknesses, what are the associated threats, what are the dangers that malicious attackers can go after. And then it's also focusing on business impact. What is the impact of these particular dangers taking advantage of discovered weaknesses? What's the impact on the organization overall? Vulnerability analysis. We discovered vulnerabilities. We're analyzing them, looking into the severity of the likelihood. And then the exploitation is the validation. It's proving that the weaknesses have publicly available exploits, or maybe exploits were developed, and it's validating that someone can gain access to a system, network, asset, um, for the purpose of demonstrating impact. And during the exploitation, they're talking about artifacts, making sure that we collect these artifacts to demonstrate that we were successful in our attempts. And then the post-exploitation, they're referring to activities like pillaging, using the data to be able to engage in a lateral movement. So from the compromised asset, being able to do further enumeration or footprinting, and leverage that particular access to gain access to another system or another network. So it's kind of interesting, they give you ideas, and obviously the most important aspect from a client perspective is the reporting. So they have a very detailed section on reporting. They give you some ideas, lessons learned, and again, very holistic, highly recommended. So to go into the threat model, I wanted to show you what I do to kind of engage in that particular phase. So I use the Microsoft Threat Modeler tool, which is free. I think the latest version is 4. And what I have in front here is a sample threat model. So the threat model, let's see if I can move things around so I can make this a little bit larger, is essentially simulating a connection from end user and what happens with the data. How does it traverse from the end user entering data to the back-end system storing the data? What happens with the data when it's at rest? So to have a kind of understanding of, think of it as a data flow, and as part of the data flow, we're identifying threats and weaknesses, so the dangers and the weaknesses, so we can assess the overall level of risk. So we have the human user, and then we have end user interaction. We're using a browser. Through the browser, we have a login request. The login request goes to a particular web server. It looks like the web server is an actual virtual machine hosted in a cloud storage. And then we have some offsite archival. We have a backup procedure. There is an authorization request that goes to an authorization provider, SAML, AD. Then there's a backend SQL database connection that is checking some through the authorization provider, some permissions, role, rule, discretion. And then the SQL database is tied into a SIM. From the web server, we also have direct logs that go into the SIM. We have a content management system, and we have access from the web server to email. So with all of this, we can actually map different attack surfaces or opportunities for attack. So what we're looking into here is you have different, it looks like, elements and properties that we can include within the threat model. So as part of the generic data flow, we have the physical framework, we have the source authenticated destination, and so on. And then what does the actual threat model look like? So based on the decisions we make in the connection points in that data flow, we're coming up with different attack surfaces or opportunities, avenues that can lead to attack and potential exploitation. So we have the web server. There's a process memory temper, and this is classified as a tempering category, and it gives you a description of what the potential threat is. So it gives you a justification, and it tells you what is the interaction. Well, we obviously have the login response. Through a login response, we can have some tempering. There's a replay attack. There is collision attack. There is a web authentication scheme that can be attacked. There is a elevation of privilege. And these are all different scenarios that are introduced based on the flow that you select. So because we have, let's see, where is it? A login request. Well, because we selected that there's a login request, we automatically are having some decisions that are related to the login response. Because we have the SQL database, all the queries can be tempered, and potentially there's an opportunity for SQL injection vulnerability. So that kind of gives you an idea of what things to look for. The threat modeling, if you understand the data flow, so typically before the pen test you ask for a data diagram, and a data diagram or network diagram will help you understand some edge devices, and what are the potential entry points, and how is this going to help you. Now, if you're receiving the network diagram, that's probably going to be a gray box or white box type of assessment. And what I did touch on is, the common, I guess, classification of these boxes is the black box is, kind of leading towards the OSS TMM. So I'm going to go all the way back here. So this is the classification of these particular assessments are more specific towards OSTMM. And what's happening is when you're typically performing a pen test in this day and age, you have three types, and this is the black box. The black box is kind of the double blind here. So typically you're given as a pen tester a domain name, IP address, or a number of them, and then the client staff, typical security analysts, engineers are not notified of the pen tester. There's a set date and time schedule. Perhaps the pen tester is communicating with the executive leadership, but not necessarily with the staff. And the staff is not providing background information as to their systems and how they log in, and they're not providing a network diagram. The gray box is kind of in the middle, so before I define it, I'm going to jump into the white box. The white box is full disclosure. It could be, given a particular account, it's given a foothold, so the penetration tester's device can sit within the internal network. It may be the specific VLAN that has access to, the credit card data holder environment. It could be that the particular asset can see systems in scope of HIPAA. It could be also given an account for a particular system that ties into a backend database, and that's for the purpose of testing it. The gray box is kind of in the middle, so it's not full disclosure. There's no the accounts. Maybe they have a foothold. They're given an internal IP address, but then nothing else. They have to map their entire network. It's kind of in the middle, and the gray is obviously very gray. If you have everything, it's white. If you have only a particular asset, domain name, it's black, and then everything in the middle is gray. So with this out of the way, we're talking about the particular engagement. So with the threat model, if we have a network diagram, we can understand the different entry points and how data may be traversing the inner routings. And that can be really helpful to help us determine low-hanging fruits. Where do we focus our attention? If it's not specifically defined in the objectives, the threat model can help us. And there are different approaches to do a threat model. There's the STRIDE, which I think is Microsoft endorsed, and it talks about spoofing identity, talks about tampering with data, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. So those are the elements that we're working on, and I believe the STRIDE model is aligned with the Microsoft Threat Modeling tool. And then you have the DREAD model. The DREAD model I like actually best because it gives me a kind of a quantitative approach. It talks about the damage, reproducibility, the exploitability, the affected users, and discoverability. And then divide everything by 5, so it draws a score. And it says, based on this score, this asset, this is how likely it is to be at risk. And then you have the CVSS. Now, I personally use CVSS for the reason being that the team that I trained for security analysis, my own analysts, as well as the engineers and technicians on the operational aspect of IT, are familiar with CVSS because of the vulnerability lifecycle management we have in place. They're familiar with the scoring system from 1 to 10, and they're familiar that if something has a CVSS overall score of 9 to 10, it's critical, and they need to fix it within one maintenance period, which is 2 weeks, or immediately, based on the criticality, the availability of exploit and existing safeguards within our ecosystem. So with CVSS, what we can do is we can drive a threat model that says, if a particular vulnerability, we're looking into the exploitability factor, we're looking into the existing safeguards, we're looking into the impact on confidentiality, availability, we're looking into the ease, the end user interaction, and stuff like this, we're making a decision that those are the ones we need to go after. Now, the disadvantage of using CVSS before you're actually completed the vulnerability analysis phase is obviously you're not going to be able to identify those low-hanging fruits. The advantage of using Stride and Dread is you can do those before the actual vulnerability analysis. So another approach is the PCI DSS penetration testing. I think it's called guideline, or it looks like actually standard, and addresses requirement 11.3 specifically for penetration testing. So I think they came out in the last couple of years, and it provided specific guidelines on what we need to do from a penetration perspective to address the requirements for PCI DSS self-attestation or actually validation by a qualified security auditor. And then it talked to us about the qualifications for the pen tester, what is the components that need to be included. They talk about that you need to do a black box, you need to do a white box, but also you need to include social engineering, because social engineering is very prevalent form of attack. And they're talking about the actual reporting guidelines and different methodologies that can be used. From the actual testing requirements, it's talking that you can engage a sampling approach. So instead of scanning all assets, you can scan a sample of assets with a similar configuration. But then all of the findings need to be remediated for all of the devices with similar configuration. It talks about the coverage of the CD, the credit data environment, and then it's talking about what are critical systems, how to do the actual segmentation validation. It's talking about the application layer testing and so on. And it provides some specific deliverables for the reporting aspect in order to address PCI DSS compliance. Now, this particular testing approach is strictly focused on PCI DSS. If we were to do HIPAA, maybe okay. HIPAA doesn't require pen testing, but maybe we can use the pen test as part of our risk assessment approach. So the pen test is more on the technical side and is focusing on the processes, on the technology, and it's testing the preparedness of the people through a form of social engineering or physical attack to react to different risks. So PCI DSS, great. Narrow focus on PCI DSS requirement and addressing those requirements. Now, talking about the reporting and some lessons learned. Obviously, the most important part of the engagement is client receiving a report, and the report needs to tell a story. And that story is drawn by the executive summary. That executive summary, we're going to have a high-level overview of, here's a breakdown of the 50 criticals that we found. Out of those 50 criticals, we exploited 15. Out of those 15, we were able to leverage them and gain lateral access to another asset that helped us achieve the objective, which was extra training data from our ERP system, or whatever the case. It gives the high-level overview of the overall security posture of the organization. How bad it is, how good have we done. The reporting, it's important to remember that the purpose is, give a high-level overview of the assessment. What did you do during the assessment? And then, how can I use that information to improve the overall security posture of the team? If the team of the organization, the analysts, the engineers, have done a good job in detecting or responding to the threat simulation through the pen test, make sure you give them credit, compliment that. But if there's obvious gaps that were identified, provide some strategic guidance and prioritize which particular categories perhaps are more in need of, I guess, to be addressed, and they need to be addressed sooner than others. So give that strategic guidelines. And then the technical is for obviously the technical people that need to focus on the remediation. So with some of the lessons learned is, report writing starts as soon as you start the execution of the pen test. As soon as you start receiving results, grab them. So screen capture, provide an artifact. Maybe you drop a text file says, on this date at this time, whatever your company was here, and we validated whatever vulnerability. So leave like a little marker. Obviously, if this is part of the engagement. But sometimes we have only one shot to validate a vulnerability, and we need to make sure that's covered. So with the other things that need to keep in mind is keep business impact in mind. What is the severity? How bad is this? What is the impact on the business that we can do from a financial perspective? How bad is getting an account on a system may not be that bad, but getting an account on an ERP system or an account on a system that we use to pivot to the ERP system can be really bad. So demonstrate what is the impact from a malicious attacker perspective. That's the value of the pen test, is you were given the organization a second chance to find these weaknesses and address them before somebody else does for them. And don't regurgitate vulnerability scan results. Don't just provide the vulnerability scan report and label it as a pen test. Go and validate the results. Go and validate the existence of these vulnerabilities. Show that you're going just beyond the automated scan. Remember, you're a professional and your job is not to point fingers. If somebody's done a good job, compliment them. If they have opportunity for improvement, make sure that you highlight that. But provide a balance. It's all about perspective. You got to remember that you don't have the ability to force the client to go in and fix things. It's about exercising your due care and due diligence to discover and adequately report these vulnerabilities and the successful exploits, and justify your value. Provide a table with results that shows the actual actionable data. What is the system that you evaluated? What port? What service? What version? What vulnerability was associated? Was the exploit successful? What are recommendations to address the vulnerability and safeguard against the exploit? Sometimes, things like, patch, it's an XP system. But what if it's a one-of-a-kind electronic medical device and it cannot be replaced? We have to have it. So patching obviously is not adequate, but what else can we do? Segmentation. Provide that strategic guidelines. Align it with the Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls. Provide, maybe if you implement the top 5, you're going to take care of all 15 categories of, identified findings that are prevalent for your organization. So the sections that, make up a report, the executive and the technical. And a holistic report, from my perspective, needs to have both. So in the executive report, obviously you need to have a cover page, table of contents, executive summary, and then executive summary, we're covering some specific areas. So the background, the scope, risk classification, and it's important for the risk classification to kind of highlight, maybe a chart, a graph. You're telling a story with the pen test. What is it that you did, and make it appealing to the end user. Don't be, very, don't be very, how to say it, wordy. Make sure that you're succinct, to the point, and you provide value. Then for the technical report, what are the examined assets, the methodology, the list of tools used, the attack details. Provide the vulnerability, the exploit. Show how you went from the actual vulnerability to a successful exploit, and demonstrate that value. And then the final thing is the actual report. Provide a table with results, line them up, and the details. And as part of the attack narrative, provide some details in how you discovered the actual vulnerability, the actual command, the result. Give some value that provides some attestation, validation that what you've discovered is actually accurate. So this in mind, this was the conclusion of a review of the different approaches for conducting a pen test engagement.